My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 62 years old, a retired pastry chef, and for the last 5 years a widow. I once believed my life's mission was to be the glue for my family, to hold the pieces together regardless of the personal cost. I dedicated my most vibrant years, my physical well-being, my financial security, and the entirety of my heart to my husband Arthur and our son. After Arthur's passing, I channeled every remaining ounce of my strength into ensuring our only child, David, never had to face the world's harshness alone. In retrospect, perhaps that was where my troubles began. With a love so cushioning it prevented him from learning the textures of reality. This afternoon, the sun streamed through the expansive windows of my high-rise apartment, casting a familiar warm glow across the polished hardwood floors. It was a daily ritual of light I had come to cherish. Beyond the glass, the East River flowed, a serene and constant presence, a silent promise of continuity that life itself rarely keeps. I was in the kitchen, the fragrant steam of a freshly brewed pot of chamomile tea rising beside me, when David entered with his wife Jessica. They didn't carry the relaxed air of family dropping by for a visit. They moved with a palpable sense of purpose, a shared agenda that hung in the air between them like a storm cloud. David's expression was tense, his jaw set, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his trousers, a telltale sign he was steeling himself for an unpleasant task. Jessica lingered a half-step behind him, her gaze sweeping across the room, cataloging the space, appraising its contents, as if mentally redecorating a property that was already hers. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mom," he began, his voice devoid of warmth, a tool sharpened for a specific job. "The apartment. It's going to Jessica's parents. They're in a tough spot, and they need it more than you do. You'll have to be out by the end of the month, and we can't have you coming back after that." The words were delivered with a cold, clean precision, each one a calculated cut. There was no softening, no apology, just the stark finality of a decision already made. For a long moment, the only sound was the delicate clink of my teaspoon against the porcelain as I set it down on the saucer. I could feel the lingering warmth of the teacup against my skin, a stark contrast to the icy chill that was beginning to seep into my bones, spreading outward from my chest. I looked at my son, the child I had nurtured from infancy, the young man whose every achievement I had celebrated, the grieving man I had held in my arms when his father died. Now that same man stood before me, looking at me not as his mother, but as an inconvenient piece of furniture that needed to be removed. If this were a story told by a stranger, the headline would be simple and brutal: "Son evicts widowed mother for in-laws." I almost smiled at the thought. Then another line came to me, one that felt truer to the moment unfolding. He said, "It's theirs now, your band." I smiled and handed him the keys. What he couldn't possibly know was that my own plans for this apartment had been set in motion long before his calculated ambush. But that was a truth he wasn't ready to hear, not yet. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and retrieved the key ring, the very one Arthur had placed in my palm the day we bought this place, his hand warm and steady over mine. The metal felt familiar, its edges softened by years of use. I walked past David, the keys making a soft, jingling sound, and placed them on the cool, unforgiving surface of the granite countertop. The noise was small, almost insignificant, but in the thick silence of the room, it landed with the weight of a gavel. "If you truly believe this is the right thing to do," I said, my voice quiet but firm, betraying none of the turmoil inside me, "then I won't stand in your way." David blinked, visibly thrown. He had come armed for a battle, for tears and recriminations. He had likely spent hours rehearsing his arguments, preparing to counter my selfishness with his practicality, my sentimentality with the urgent needs of Jessica's struggling parents. By yielding so easily, I had disarmed him, leaving him with a prepared speech for a play that was no longer being performed. A flicker of something, relief mixed with a smirk, crossed Jessica's face. David, however, looked merely uncomfortable. A brief shadow of doubt crossed his eyes, but it was quickly extinguished. He reached out and took the keys, his fingers closing around them without another word. My mind, however, was anything but silent. My thoughts were clear, precise, and sharper than they had been in years. The comforting aroma of chamomile and lavender filled the air, a strange, gentle counterpoint to the bitter taste of betrayal in my throat. My heart beat with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a steady drumbeat in the quiet room. I was acutely aware of every detail: the sleek cold of the countertop beneath my fingertips, the low hum of the sub-zero refrigerator, the distant, muffled roar of the city 20 stories below. I watched my son's face as he pocketed the keys, searching for any trace of the boy who used to draw me pictures of our family in a house with a sprawling garden. There was none. This was a man driven by pragmatism, a man who had learned to be ruthless. Perhaps the world had made him that way. Or, more painfully, perhaps I had, by always saying yes, by always absorbing the cost. Jessica cleared her throat, her tone businesslike, as if she were finalizing a transaction. "We'll start moving their things in next weekend," she announced, addressing me as if I were a departing tenant rather than the woman whose home she was systematically dismantling. "It's really for the best. For the best." I had heard that phrase before, always from people who were taking something that wasn't theirs to take. I had never fought them, and I wouldn't start now. That was the crucial difference between them and me. They mistook silence for surrender. I understood that silence could be a strategy, a space in which to gather strength. I gave a single small nod. "I understand," I said, allowing the words to settle into the uncomfortable quiet. I then took a step back, creating a clear path to the door. David hesitated for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, but a touch from Jessica on his arm was enough to guide him toward the elevator. The apartment door closed with a soft, definitive click, a sound that resonated in the sudden emptiness. Alone, I let my gaze drift back to the river. The surface was calm, but I knew the powerful currents that churned beneath, currents that could pull a person under before they even knew they were in danger. My fingers traced the spot on the counter where the keys had been. My mind was already at work, planning the next steps with the same precision I once used to layer a complex cake. Each element had to be perfect, each step executed with patience, all leading to a final, flawless presentation. I had been preparing for a day like this, though not in the way David could ever imagine. I knew my son. I had watched the pattern for years. A series of small requests had slowly escalated into significant demands. A lifetime of my acquiescence had taught him that the word no was simply not in my vocabulary. But he was wrong. I knew the word. I had just been waiting for the right moment to use it. If he believed his pronouncement today was the final word on my place in this home, he was mistaken. If he believed I would simply walk away with nothing, he was profoundly mistaken. The sun dipped lower, and the light in the room softened, casting long, dramatic shadows across the floor. I poured the remainder of my tea down the sink, rinsed the delicate cup, and placed it upside down on a linen towel to dry. My movements were unhurried, imbued with the calm of someone who knows they are not playing catch-up. They are simply waiting for the opportune moment to make their opening move. "If you think that's what's right," I whispered to the empty room, the words tasting different now, charged with a new meaning, "then that's what it will be. Only this time, I was the one who would define what was right. It would not be his version of right. It would be mine." As the grandfather clock in the hall ticked on, marking the seconds in the profound quiet, I could almost hear Arthur's voice, as clear and steady as it was in life. "You were never as fragile as you let them believe, Eleanor." I dried my hands on the towel, the one embroidered with our initials, a relic from a life that felt both a century ago and like yesterday. Then, looking toward the door through which they had just departed, I allowed myself the barest hint of a smile. I had given them the keys, but I had never for a single moment given them my home. I didn't move for a long time after the door clicked shut. The silence in the apartment seemed to expand, pushing the walls outward, making the grand space feel cavernous and empty. The last wisp of steam from the kettle rose into the afternoon light and disappeared, and the room seemed to exhale, settling into a different kind of quiet. I can still recall the exact shade of that evening sky. It was a soft graphite gray, like a sketch waiting for color. The river below was a ribbon of fractured silver, and the city seemed to lower its voice in deference to the coming night. My thoughts drifted back to another evening, years ago, one steeped in rain and warmth. It was a memory I had held onto like a precious stone, smooth and comforting to the touch. The memory began with me unfolding a white linen tablecloth, one my grandmother had embroidered with painstaking care when she was a young woman. Tiny, delicate stalks of wheat traced the hem, a patient, looping script. The fabric released a faint scent of lavender and cedar from the chest where it was kept, reserved for special occasions or moments that needed to be made special. I smoothed it across the dining table, my palms feeling the fine, cool texture. On the stove, a heavy cast-iron pot held a beef stew that had been simmering for hours, a dish Arthur had always called a hug in a bowl. The onions had melted into a sweet, savory base, the carrots were tender enough to yield to the slightest pressure from a fork, and the rich aroma of beef, thyme, and black pepper filled the kitchen, a stark and welcoming contrast to the storm brewing outside. I had put on an old jazz record, a gentle saxophone melody that never seemed to be in a hurry. It climbed and circled, leaving generous spaces for silence, the way a good host makes room for a guest who arrives late. David had called from the lobby, his voice sounding small and weary over the intercom. I didn't make him knock. I opened the door just as the elevator arrived. Rain clung to him, shimmering in his dark hair and on his jawline. He shook his head and offered a weak laugh. And for a fleeting second, he looked like he was 9 years old again, standing on the doorstep after a losing baseball game, his face smudged with dirt and disappointment. He told me he was starving. He said his own small apartment smelled of stale takeout and the metallic tang of unfulfilled ambition. He confessed, with a surprising vulnerability, that he had forgotten what a real dinner tasted like, one that was cooked with intention and care. I took his damp coat and hung it near a radiator to dry. We didn't sit at the formal dining table. Instead, we ate at the small table by the window, because the city is always better company when it's wrapped in rain. The streetlights below were stretched into long, shimmering ribbons of gold by the puddles, and the river was a dark, steady presence, drawing a line between our quiet world and the chaos beyond. He lifted the first spoonful of stew to his lips and closed his eyes. I watched his shoulders, which had been tight and high with tension, visibly drop. It was as if a tightly clenched fist was uncurling, finger by slow finger. He started talking between mouthfuls, the way a person does when they are so hungry they remember they are allowed to be vulnerable, especially at a table where they know they are loved. He spoke of exhausting shifts at his finance job, of a senior partner who seemed to find fault in everything, of a relentless schedule that always seemed to be pushing the finish line further away. I listened, refilling his bowl before he had to ask, wanting the simple grounding presence of the meal to act as an anchor against the storm of his life. When he finally asked about the penthouse, his voice softer, I told him the truth. I had bought it just a couple of months after his father passed away. I needed a place, I explained, where grief didn't feel like a performance, where I didn't have to manage anyone else's sorrow. I told him about the balcony facing east, and how I would sit out there in a simple chair as the sun came up, practicing how to breathe again without an audience. He got up from the table and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, the same one he had stood before just hours ago with a completely different purpose. He pressed his palm flat against the cool glass, as if he could feel the pulse of the river through it. He stood there for a long time before turning back to me, his eyes filled with a clarity that seemed to come from a deep, quiet place inside him. He said a sentence that took up permanent residence in my heart from that moment on. Home is where love stays. He didn't say it like a well-worn proverb he'd read somewhere. He said it like a profound discovery, a truth he had just unearthed for himself. He looked from the half-empty bowl of stew to the embroidered tablecloth, to the rain-streaked river, and then to me, and I knew he meant it with every fiber of his being. I told him he could come here whenever he wanted, that this door would always be open to him. He reached across the table and took my hand, his grip having the same quiet, reassuring strength it had when he was a little boy, and the hallway at night seemed too long and dark to navigate alone. After dinner, I brought out the old family album. Its leather cover was cracked and softened at the corners from decades of being held and opened. We sat on the sofa, shoulder to shoulder, and slowly turned the heavy pages. There was Arthur in the old bakery, a dusting of flour on his cheek, his eyes crinkling with laughter. There was David as a toddler, perched on a milk crate, trying to pipe frosting onto a birthday cake, his concentration absolute. There was my own mother, standing by a clothesline of sun-drenched white sheets, The very same tablecloth waving gently in the breeze like a small, proud flag. We didn't say much. The saxophone on the record player filled the spaces, allowing for a kind of soft, shared remembering that words would have only diminished. When he finally left, long after the rain had stopped, he kissed my temple and promised to come back on Saturday. I watched the elevator numbers descend and thought to myself, rituals are what hold us. Love leaves a trail of crumbs. The people who are meant to come back will always find their way. Now, in the crushing quiet of the present, I walked to the linen chest and took out that same tablecloth. I held it up to the waning light. The delicate wheat stalks seemed to glow. Each tiny stitch was a crossing over, a small journey of thread, leaving and returning, binding the fabric together. I ran my thumb along the hem and could almost feel my grandmother's patient, steady hands. Then I folded it carefully and put it back in its place. The cast iron pot was cold on the stove. The record player was silent. The building itself seemed to be holding its breath. The sentence David had given me on that rainy night echoed through the empty rooms, searching for evidence of its truth. Home is where love stays. It checked the chair by the window. It checked the single mug on the counter. It looked toward the door where my son had stood this afternoon and issued his decree. I pictured Jessica mentally measuring the walls for her parents' furniture, her mind already erasing a life that was not hers. I pictured David practicing a hardness that had never suited him, a mask that didn't fit the contours of his face. The beautiful memory of that night tilted precariously under the weight of this new, harsher reality, but it did not break. Outside, the sky was darkening further, leaning toward another rain. A foghorn sounded a lonely, complaining note from the river. I breathed in, then out, letting the air settle my hands. I reminded myself that objects have memories. Linen remembers. Cast iron remembers. A window remembers. Every face that has ever looked through it, searching for a view. I was not trying to erase a life. I was simply trying to let a memory hold on to its original meaning. I filled a pot with water and set it on the stove. Not for tea this time, but just for the comfort of steam. The quiet in the apartment slowly widened, becoming kind again. I looked at the door with a sense of calm that had been absent an hour ago. The boy who said home is where love stays was still a part of my son. The man who said the apartment is theirs now was also a part of him. I realized I could hold both of those truths at the same time, without letting one cancel out the other, and without letting either of them define who I was. Before the water could even begin to simmer, I let myself recall one more detail from that rainy night. The way David had leaned his forehead against the glass and traced a circle in the condensation with his knuckle. The way he had looked back at me, a silent question in his eyes that needed no words. And the way I had answered by simply setting my hand over his for a moment, a pledge made without lawyers or paperwork. If love stays, home stays. But if love chooses to leave, I stay. The rain began to fall again, thin silver threads against the dark glass. I turned away from the window and faced the room I now had to protect. I knew what my next step would be, and I knew exactly who I needed to call. I turned off the stove and wiped the countertop until it was completely dry. The kitchen seemed to close in on itself, like a book being shut for the last time. I slipped on my coat. The fabric felt cool against my skin, as if the room itself had already adjusted its climate, marking me as someone who no longer belonged. I folded the precious linen tablecloth, checked that the balcony door was securely locked, and picked up my purse. The silence that followed me to the door was polite but unmistakably final. As I pulled the door shut behind me, feeling the soft press of the seal against my cheek, I hesitated. In that brief moment, I could almost hear the apartment breathing, the way a seashell holds the sound of a distant ocean. A departure, if not resisted, can so easily be mistaken for consent. The hallway, with its faint, clean smell of carpet shampoo, felt anonymous. The elevator button glowed with a warm amber light as I pressed it. When the door slid open, a cool, refrigerated hush washed over me. I selected the button for the lobby and watched the numbers descend in the digital display. 40, 39, 30. In the polished steel of the doors, my reflection looked like a woman who was practicing how to occupy less space than a room allowed. At floor 30, a man carrying a violin case stepped in. We exchanged the brief, careful smiles of strangers tacitly agreeing to share a small, silent space. The numbers continued their descent: 23, 19, 15. The elevator cables sang their quiet, metallic hymn. I found myself wanting to ask the man if music was his profession or his refuge, but I let the question remain unasked. The building offered me nowhere to go but down. 742. A soft bell chimed with a manufactured cheerfulness. The lobby greeted me with the impersonal grandeur of polished marble and air conditioned to a chill that found the bones in my neck. The evening concierge raised a hand in a gesture of acknowledgement. I returned it. The revolving door gathered me in its glass arms and deposited me onto the avenue. The city air was thick with the smells of recent rain and warm metal. A taxi pulled over as if it had been summoned by my unspoken need. I gave the driver the address of my rental in Brooklyn. He repeated it with a patient, careful pronunciation that for a fleeting moment reminded me of Arthur. We merged into the river of traffic. The city lights opened and closed like the gills of some massive sleeping creature. Bridges stitched their way across the dark water, and the iconic skyline gradually receded. I drew a line with my finger in the condensation on the window and watched it slowly disappear. My rental apartment in Brooklyn is a small, unassuming place. It is honest about its own limitations. The stairwell smells of old wood varnish and the ghosts of 1,000 grocery trips. The lock on the third-floor door yields with a stubborn, metallic groan. I appreciate it for being truthful about the effort required. Inside, the hardwood floors seemed to hold a reservoir of stored sunlight. The old radiator stood silently, guarding its secrets for the winter to come. I placed my purse on the small kitchen counter and stood perfectly still, waiting for the room to remember who I was. The first night after a rupture has its own unique gravity. It pulls at your lungs, turning your ribcage into a gate that refuses to swing open. I poured a glass of water and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress offered a firm, plain sort of kindness. Outside, a siren's wail entered into a fierce argument with the quiet. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed and stayed shut. Breathing is supposed to be simple, an unconscious act. That night, it was a task that required conscious management. In for a count of 4, hold, out for a count of 6. I coached myself through it like a novice. My chest obeyed, but only in small, grudging increments. A tight, persistent knot formed just beneath my collarbone, a physical manifestation of a pain that refused to be named. I simply allowed it to be there. I've learned that resisting pain only gives it a sharper edge. The window was open, just a crack, the width of 2 fingers. The air that drifted in carried the soft, gritty scent of late-night traffic. I wanted the night to pass smoothly, like a clean, even stitch. Instead, it felt like it was worrying a tangle, pulling it tighter with every passing hour. I pulled my suitcase out from under the bed and lifted the heavy photo album from inside. The aged leather felt like a familiar, comforting handshake. The corners were worn smooth from years of being held, of pages being turned and returned to. I placed it on my lap and opened it to the first page. There was Arthur, standing in what looked like a snowstorm of flour at the bakery, a candid shot that had caught him laughing with his eyes. I traced the outline of his face with one finger. The paper remained cool to the touch, no matter how much warmth I tried to impart. I turned the page. David is a toddler, wielding a wooden spoon like a scepter. My mother standing beside sunlit sheets, the embroidered tablecloth a small white flag, signaling home. The bakery in winter, its windows fogged with the warm breath of baking bread. Each image conjured its own distinct atmosphere, and my body seemed to tilt and sway to match each one. As the photographs moved closer to the present, a slight tremor started in my hands. It wasn't a dramatic, theatrical shaking, but a fine, private unrest that made the corners of the pages quiver before they settled. I paused at a picture of David when he was 10. His sleeves were rolled up, and he was frosting a cake with the intense seriousness of a surgeon. He had misspelled happy with only 1 P, and had adamantly refused to scrape it off, insisting that joy had already decided on its own shape. I remembered the sound of his laughter echoing down the hallway, bright and unrestrained. I remembered how he used to trace the veins on the back of my hands as if they were maps to a hidden treasure. The tremor in my own hands grew stronger, I set the album down on the blanket and pressed my palms together, rubbing them briskly until a small pool of warmth gathered. Then I picked the book up again. I breathed in. I breathed out. I took a mental inventory of the feelings that resided in me: grief, exhaustion, and a stubborn, quiet hope that refused to be extinguished. I closed the album and rested it against my knees. The room did not feel hostile. It felt watchful, patient. I could see the long corridor of hours stretching between midnight and morning. Each hour would present a choice: to replay the pain or to rest. I turned off the lamp and let the city lights paint a shallow, moving river across the ceiling. In that dim, watery light, I allowed myself to float. Sleep, when it finally came, was thin and fitful. But it came, and within it, a single sentence anchored itself in my consciousness, quiet and durable. I do not have to win tonight. I only have to stay. When I woke, the air in the room had cooled. My hands were steady enough to pour water for tea. I wrapped my palms around the warm mug and felt a quiet gratitude for the simple mercy of morning. The day ahead would be filled with decisions. The world would continue to speak its language of needs and demands. But for now, I just stood at the window, watching a plane draw a slow, patient arc across a new sky. The page had not been torn out. It had simply been turned. I met George on the stairs the next morning. The building smelled of fresh coffee and the damp newsprint of papers delivered to the corner bodega. He was 2 steps above me and paused, tipping his worn tweed cap. We had exchanged nods for months, the silent acknowledgement of neighbors. But today, his eyes lingered on my face, as if he had heard my difficult night breathing through the walls. "You look like someone carrying a room on her back," he said, his voice raspy but kind. I tried to laugh, but the sound remained trapped in my chest. I told him I was fine. He looked at the lie, held it up to the light for a moment, and chose not to challenge it. He stepped aside to let me pass, then followed me down to the lobby. At the mailboxes, he sorted his envelopes with a practiced efficiency: bills to one side, junk mail to the other, a single postcard in the middle that he turned over twice. I hovered nearby, my own mailbox empty. He noticed and tilted his cap back. It was an invitation. "Coffee?" he asked. "The place on the corner makes an honest cup. Sit with me. It'll give your hands something to do." We sat at a small table by the window. George stirred 2 packets of sugar into his paper cup, then set the wooden stirrer down with the care of someone concluding a small, important ritual. "I had a house once," he began, not looking at me but at the street outside. Bayside. 2 stories, with a porch big enough for 7 chairs and a radio. My Helen, she grew tomatoes against the south fence. My boys did their homework at the kitchen table. Summer nights, the neighbors would bring over peaches, and we'd trade stories until the mosquitoes drove us inside. It wasn't a palace, but it was a faithful house. He smiled, a brief, fond memory. Then the smile folded in on itself. My younger boy, Kevin. He could fix anything but his own luck. A good heart, you know. He'd change your tire in a downpour and then forget to cash his own paycheck. He got mixed up with a contractor who paid him in promises instead of wages. You know the story. By winter, he had a mountain of bills and a look in his eyes that said he couldn't see a path to spring. George lifted his cup but didn't drink. He asked to borrow against the house, not sell it, he swore. Just a loan to get him square. He'd pay it back in a year, 6 months if a big job came through. Helen said we should wait, think it over. I said we couldn't stand by and watch our own son drown while we were safe on the shore. So I signed the papers. It started small. Then the interest payments started breeding like mice in the walls. Kevin kept saying he had it handled. He was handling it the way a man handles an incoming tide, by getting wet. Helen started clipping coupons. I took on extra shift, pretending they were hobbies. The bank was polite and understanding, right up until the day they weren't. He paused, his gaze distant. The day the man with the clipboard came, Helen was baking an apple pie. The house smelled of cinnamon and love. He said the timing was unfortunate. He said the paperwork was all in order. He said we would have a reasonable window to vacate. I asked him if he'd ever had to pack up 35 years of Sundays in a reasonable window. He said he understood. I told him he didn't. George's laugh was a short, rusted sound. Neighbors offered couches. Church ladies packed our wedding photos with the reverence of a sacrament. Kevin stopped coming around. Shame is a locksmith that works from the inside out. Helen went to stay with her sister for a couple of weeks and just never came back to me. Said she couldn't bear the thought of hearing another family's laughter in our kitchen, finding our light switches in the dark. He finally took a sip of his coffee. So now I have this apartment. It's fine. The radiator has its moods, but we understand each other. I buy myself flowers on Fridays. People survive worse. But still, sometimes, a bus door will hiss open and I'll smell cinnamon, and for a second I'll look for Helen in the reflection and just see my own stupid hat. He looked directly at me then, his eyes clear and knowing. Someone took your room, he said softly. I can see the empty frame around you. Maybe it was a person. Maybe it was just a moment. The shape of the loss is always the same. You want to be the good mother, the one who waits on the porch with the light on. You think if you're gentle enough, you can coax a hard thing into being soft. But I'm old enough to tell you, Eleanor, that softness just invites teeth when the world decides you're on the menu. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. I don't know your son. I'm sure he's a good man in his own way. But there's a line our children can't cross without becoming strangers to us. Ask me how I know. He slid the postcard across the table. It showed a generic beach with 2 empty chairs. On the back, in neat block letters, was a return address in Florida and nothing else. He's sober now, George said, tapping the card. Fixes appliances. He calls on Sundays, says he wants to visit. I tell him the door's open. I also remind him I live on the 3rd floor and there's no elevator. Stairs are part of the price of admission. I forgive him every single morning, but I can't afford to forget. The coffee was cold now. Neither of us cared. You'll be told to be patient, he said, his gaze steady and intense. But patience is a virtue only until it becomes a leash. You'll be told family is everything, but family is only everything until it starts to eat the person you are. Grief will borrow your voice and try to speak for you. Let it have its say, then take your mouth back. He pushed his chair back and stood up. The bell on the bodega door chimed as a young mother came in. The world outside declared itself open for business. George placed a gentle, steadying hand on my shoulder. Write down your boundary while your hand is still steady, he said. Invite love to the table, but lock the door against entitlement. And Eleanor, listen to me. Whatever you do, please do not let yourself become a guest in your own home. George's sentence trailed me from the bodega all the way to the subway station, a steady, rhythmic beat against the pavement. Do not let yourself become a guest in your own home. I didn't rush. With each step, I felt my feet relearning how to connect with the ground beneath them. At the turnstile, swiping my transit card with a newfound decisiveness, I knew who I had to call. I needed to speak with Sarah. It had been too long. We moved in different circles these days, but our friendship was one of the bedrock certainties of my life. At Arthur's funeral, she hadn't offered platitudes. She had pressed a container of homemade soup into my hands and simply stayed with me until I had eaten every last spoonful. Sarah was a listener who engaged with her entire being, but she was also a real estate lawyer who practiced her craft without a hint of sentimentality. She was exactly what I needed. She answered on the second ring, her voice the same as it had ever been, a calm, clear tone that held both warmth and precision. She said my name with a certainty that made me feel seen. I told her I needed coffee and truth in equal measure, and as soon as possible. She didn't ask for details. She just said my office, now. 3 stops on the F train. If the transit gods were smiling. As the train rattled through the dark tunnels, I clutched my purse on my lap, a small rehearsal for the act of holding on to what was rightfully mine. Her office building was situated above a flower shop, and the elevator carried the faint, sweet scent of lilies and damp earth. It delivered me to a quiet corridor lined with antique maps of New York City. The door to her office suite opened before I had a chance to knock. Sarah stood there, a little more silver threading through her dark hair now, but with the same sharp, compassionate eyes. She wasted no time on small talk. She ushered me in, closed the door, and asked a question that needed no preamble. Eleanor, Do you want to keep being pushed out of your own life? Or are you ready to step back into it? The question bypassed all my defenses and went straight to my spine, which seemed to answer before my mouth could. I sat in the comfortable leather chair opposite her large oak desk and told her everything. I told her about David and Jessica's arrival, the keys landing on the granite countertop, Jessica's brisk, dismissive tone, and David's words, which had been shaped like a final verdict. I told her about the memory of the rainy night and the embroidered tablecloth, about my new neighbor George and his story of loss, and about the one clear sentence that had been standing guard inside me ever since. As I spoke, Sarah was already at her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard, navigating city records with an expert's ease. She asked for my full name, the property's block and lot number, the date of purchase. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder, the one Arthur had always teased me about keeping. For a rainy day, he'd said. It was filled with copies of every important document related to our life together. I handed it over. We went through it, line by methodical line. The original deed, the mortgage satisfaction papers, decades of tax receipts, the insurance policies, the condo association bylaws. There were even minutes from the board meeting where my application had been approved all those years ago. My signature was a familiar presence on every page. There was no joint tenancy with David, no transfer on death clause, no lingering encumbrance. My name stood alone, clear and indisputable. Sarah leaned back in her chair and took off her glasses, placing them carefully on a stack of files. Your ownership is airtight, Eleanor. Legally, it's as clean as it gets. What your son believes he has the authority to give away simply does not belong to him. She paused, her expression softening. Grief can warp a person's judgment. And entitlement, well, it has a nasty habit of rewriting the dictionary. People like that start calling gifts obligations. They start renaming taking as helping. The law, thankfully, doesn't share their vocabulary. Something inside my chest clicked. A feeling not of triumph, but of profound orientation. It was like I had been navigating through a dense fog, and suddenly a strong, steady wind had blown it all away, revealing the path right in front of me. I could see the curb. Sarah printed out the title abstract and slid it across the desk toward me. Then she took a yellow legal pad and a pen. She drew a large rectangle at the top of the page. All right, she said, her tone shifting from friend to strategist. Let's look at your options. There are 3 main paths we can take to build you a fortress. She drew a line down from the rectangle and labeled the first path. Option 1 is the simplest. Keep the title as is, but add layers of security. We can draft a clear, legally binding document that outlines terms of use for any guest, which David would have to sign to even get a spare key. We can put the condo board on formal notice that only you have authority over the unit. It's a defensive posture. It works, but it can feel like you're constantly bracing for the next assault. She drew a second line. Option 2. We move the asset into a revocable trust. Think of a trust as a legal container. You transfer the title of the penthouse from Eleanor Vance to the Eleanor Vance Revocable Trust. You would be the trustee, meaning you still have complete control. You can live in it, sell it, do whatever you want. But the ownership is technically held by the trust, which makes it much harder for someone to make a claim or try to pressure you. You would name a successor trustee, like me, to manage it if you become incapacitated. It's a stronger wall. Then she drew the third line. And this was the one she tapped with the end of her pen. Option 3 is the most powerful, and I think it's the one that fits you best. We transfer the title to a new charitable foundation. We can name it after Arthur. At the same time, we file a legal instrument called a life estate that gives you the absolute, legally recorded right to live in and control the property for the rest of your life. No one can touch that right. The penthouse belongs to the foundation, but your home belongs to you. When you pass away, the asset remains with the foundation to be used for its charitable mission. This move makes your intent unmistakable. It puts the penthouse completely beyond anyone's manipulation. It's not just a wall, it's a castle with a moat, and you are the queen inside. We took a break to make tea in the small office kitchen. She told me about a client, an elderly aunt who had let a nephew stay for a season, and woke up 5 years later to find him claiming squatter's rights, arguing he'd made a verbal agreement for ownership. The courts eventually sorted it out, but the family was shattered beyond repair. Sarah wasn't telling me this to scare me. She was showing me with cool clarity the consequences of not acting decisively. Back at her desk, she pushed the legal pad toward me. "Before you choose a path," she said, "I need you to think about your values. Forget the law for a second. What is the outcome here that will let you sleep through the night?" I didn't have to think for long. "I want to honor the home Arthur and I built," I said, my voice steady. "I want to stop teaching David that my love is a resource he can endlessly exploit. And I want to keep my home without having to turn my heart into a block of concrete to do it." Sarah nodded slowly, a small smile touching her lips. "That's what I thought you'd say. The law is good at separating rights from resentments, Eleanor. We can secure one and let you release the other." She tapped the third option again. "The charitable foundation with a life estate does all of that. It honors Arthur's memory, creates an unbreakable boundary, and lets you live in your home with peace of mind." That was it. The fog was completely gone. I knew my course. We began the paperwork right then. The name of the foundation, its purpose, its governance, the trustees. Sarah suggested language I never would have thought of, about preserving housing dignity for those in need. Words that sounded like something Arthur himself would have said, his hand resting reassuringly on my shoulder. When she slid the initial formation document across the desk, I picked up the pen. It felt solid and balanced in my hand. My signature was clear and unwavering. Sarah filed the papers electronically and scheduled a notary to come to her office the next day. She reviewed the next steps with me: record the new deed, file the life estate memorandum, notify the condo board and the insurance company, store all original copies in a secure place. She handed me a neatly typed checklist, with today's date at the top. We paused for a moment. She placed both of her hands flat on the folder containing the new documents, as if she were blessing bread. "I'll keep notarized copies of everything here," she said. "You keep the originals. And Eleanor, if anyone ever tries to tell you that love requires your complete and total surrender, I want you to show them page 4. I stood up, and the room felt taller, the air easier to breathe. At the door, she touched my elbow gently. "Now, prepare yourself for the conversation that's inevitably coming. Decide on your words now, while you're calm, so you don't end up borrowing them from anger later." On the sidewalk outside, I walked past the flower shop, and on an impulse, bought a bouquet of white peonies. I carried them to the subway like a soft, fragrant shield. On the train ride back to Brooklyn, I held the flowers in one arm and the folder in the other, feeling the weight of my life finally dividing itself properly. Paper for the law, petals for the living. I practiced the sentences I would need. I will not argue. I will not explain what the law already makes clear. I will state the fact once and let silence do the rest of the work. Back in my small apartment, I found a vase for the peonies and placed the folder on the table beside the family album. One held the past, the other held the future. Both were mine. The latch on the drawer where I placed the folder caught with a satisfying, definitive click. The apartment felt less like a waiting room and more like a command center. I looked out the window, the city exhaled, and the river kept its steady, patient line. George's words met Sarah's question. "Do not be a guest in your own home. Step back into your life." The night held me without a struggle. My breathing was even, matching the river's steady pace. I slept deeply and woke up stronger. The plan was no longer just a plan. It was in motion. By morning, the checklist Sarah had given me had transformed from a series of tasks into a tangible resolve. Action, I was discovering, was a much cleaner pillow to rest one's head on than worry. I called Sarah's office promptly at 9. She answered with the practiced calm of a person who sharpens their pencils before a storm arrives. We met at her office, and she began without ceremony. "A charitable foundation," she reiterated, tapping a newly printed document, named for Arthur Vance. "Its purpose is anchored in providing housing dignity. The structure is built to keep this asset safe and useful for generations." We would officially transfer the title of the penthouse to this new entity. Simultaneously, we would file my life estate, which was my legally recorded, unbreakable right to live there, to enjoy it, to maintain it, and to guide the foundation's mission for as long as I lived. Upon my death, The property would remain with the foundation to support families who were transitioning out of homelessness. The lines were clear, the law was clean, and there was absolutely no room for emotional manipulation or confusion. Sarah slid the draft of the foundation's charter across her desk. The name, when I read it in print, felt like a perfect chord. The Arthur Vance Foundation for Home and Hearth. She calmly pointed to each clause, translating the dense legal language into plain English. The conveyance of property, the life estate memorandum, my obligations for maintenance, insurance requirements, the foundation's tax status, the composition of the board, the charitable purpose. She had constructed a fortress out of words, and was now inviting me to test its gates and hinges. I signed the formation papers. She had already arranged for a mobile notary, who arrived moments later. The woman's official stamp descended onto the paper with a crisp, satisfying thud. "This isn't drama," Sarah said, watching the ink dry. "This is design. We are designing your boundaries so they never have to shout to be heard." From her office, we went to my bank, where we opened a new account for the foundation. I signed the signature cards. The branch manager, a kind man who had known Arthur, shook my hand warmly. We recorded the initial capitalization, a modest sum to begin, with the understanding that the penthouse itself constituted the bulk of the foundation's value. From the bank, we took a taxi to the county clerk's office to record the new deed. It was a large, imposing building filled with the quiet, bureaucratic hum of a city keeping track of itself. The clerk who assisted us was efficient, checking our packet of documents with a practiced eye before nodding. When the scanner clicked and whirred, capturing the image of the new deed, a fundamental line shifted in the city's official memory. The penthouse was no longer listed under my personal name. It now belonged on the foundation's ledger. The life estate, bearing my signature, was attached like a seal. As we left the building, I asked Sarah if it made sense that I was feeling a pang of guilt. She shook her head without hesitation. "You're not hiding, Eleanor. You're stewarding. It is not selfish to put on your own oxygen mask first. It is not cruel to stop confusing surrender with love." Back at her office, we drafted the notification letters. One to the condo board, one to the insurance company, one to my accountant. Each letter was professional, concise, and contained the same plain sentence near the top. "Effective as of today's date, ownership of Unit 20B has been transferred to the Arthur Vance Foundation for Home and Hearth. Eleanor Vance retains a recorded life estate interest in the property." There was no melodrama, no pleading, just the clear, irrefutable outline of a new architecture. We scheduled the foundation's first board meeting. It would be small and dignified to start. Sarah and I would serve as the initial members, and we would recruit 2 more with experience in housing advocacy. I suggested Mr. Peterson, the head concierge in my building, as a potential community advisor. "He knows what safety looks like when a lobby goes quiet at night," I said. Sarah thought it was an excellent idea. She turned her monitor toward me so I could see the digital folder she had created. It was filling up, the documents stacking like perfectly laid bricks: deed, life estate memorandum, articles of incorporation, bylaws, IRS acknowledgement, bank resolution, board notice, insurance endorsement request. That afternoon, I walked to the promenade by the river and leaned against the railing. The water moved, indifferent to my small human drama. Barges passed like slow, patient animals. Gulls stitched the gray sky with their bright, sharp cries. The feeling that rose up in me was not the hot flush of vengeance. It was a quiet sense of symmetry. For years, I had taught my son that my love meant unlimited access, a door that was never locked. Today, I had taught the world, and more importantly myself, a different lesson. Love has rooms. Rooms have doors. Doors have locks. And locks are opened by invitation, not by demand. Power, I was learning, did not feel like a clenched fist. It felt like a straight spine. I found myself standing taller. I rehearsed the inevitable conversation in my head. I would not initiate it, but I would not run from it either. If David asked why his key no longer worked, I would tell him the locks had been changed for security. If he asked who owned the apartment now, I would tell him it belonged to his father's legacy, a place where meaning had matured and grown outward. On the way back to my Brooklyn rental, I stopped at a hardware store and had a small brass plate engraved. The letters were square, elegant, and simple. The Arthur Vance Foundation for Home and Hearth. I would install it myself, discreetly, near the entryway. It wasn't a boast. It was a compass, a way to mark true north. Back in the apartment, I set out a blank sheet of paper and wrote the foundation's mission statement in longhand before I typed it up. There is something about forming words with your own hand that steadies you. Shelter is what keeps the weather out. Care is what keeps the loneliness out. Law is what keeps predation out. This foundation is built to provide all three. This would hold. I signed my name at the bottom and breathed more easily than I had in weeks. I placed the completed folder in the drawer and brewed a cup of tea. I thought of Arthur's hands, always dusted white with flour. I thought of David's childhood grin when he had misspelled happy. Both memories were true. Both were mine to keep. But neither of them would be allowed to write my future. Strength could be gentle, and gentleness, when it finally found a proper frame, could be incredibly strong. Around noon, my phone buzzed, lighting up with David's name. I took a deep breath and answered before my courage could find an excuse to hide. "Mom, quick heads up," he said, his voice brisk and efficient, the tone of someone confirming a business reservation. "We're moving Jessica's parents into the penthouse this weekend. The movers are booked for Saturday morning, and we'll bring their boxes over on Sunday. The elevator slot is already confirmed with the building. And I'm bringing a locksmith by on Saturday afternoon to change the cylinders. It'll just be smoother for everyone if you're not there." The words didn't land like a blow this time. They marched past me like a parade I had no interest in watching. I looked at the kettle on my stove, at the brass plate resting on the counter waiting for its screws. My spine felt like a steel rod. "I understand," I said. Each syllable was precise, clean, and utterly devoid of the emotion he was likely expecting. He took my quietness as agreement and continued, filling the silence with his logistics. "I'll need you to leave the spare set of keys from your desk with the concierge, Mr. Peterson. Jessica's dad has a bad knee, so the fewer steps we have to deal with, the better. Also, if you could get all your personal things out by Friday, that would be great. It's just awkward to have to pack around someone else's memories." I kept my breathing slow and even. "I understand," I repeated. The sentence was a perfect, smooth stone in my mouth. He mistook my calm for compliance. Entitlement is an affliction that often causes deafness. "Great," he said, the relief in his voice palpable. "This is really for the best, Mom. I know you barely use the place anyway. Thanks for being so reasonable about this." I could hear papers rustling in the background. He was already moving on to the next item on his agenda. "I'll text you the exact schedule." "I understand," I said for the third and final time. Then I ended the call. The room didn't change, but the quality of the light seemed to. My pulse, which had quickened slightly, stepped back down and stood calmly on the landing. The silence in the apartment expanded, filling its lungs. I placed my phone face down on the counter. My hands did not shake. The power of not offering an explanation filled the room like a quiet tide turning beneath a pier. A series of texts arrived in a rapid-fire burst. Saturday 9 a.m. 1 p.m., Sunday 10 a.m., locksmith at 2 p.m. I read each message as if it were an itinerary for a trip I had no intention of taking. Then I muted the conversation thread. The boundary was set. The conversation was complete. My sleep was dreamless. A deep and restorative quiet. I lay on my side counting my breaths in for 4, out for 6. Between each count, I listed the truths I would not negotiate. I am the steward of this home. Love does not require theft. A boundary is a kindness that keeps poison out. I rose around midnight and stood at the window of the small Brooklyn apartment. The neighborhood was hushed, the silence punctuated only by the sigh of a late bus. I pressed my palm to the cool glass, just as David once had, and the window pane answered with its steady cold. In the faint reflection, I saw the outline of my own shoulders, squared and unburdened. Grief was still present in the room, but it was no longer chairing the meeting. I brewed a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the small table with a pen and a piece of stationery. I began a letter to myself, dated and signed, not for any legal purpose, but for the sake of memory. Today, I chose the frame that fits my own life. Today I learned that saying less can hold more weight than a speech. Today I learned that I understand is a door that can be closed softly, locking itself from the right side. When the teacup was empty, I rinsed it and folded a dish towel neatly over the sink's edge. I turned off the lights and lay down again. The bed felt welcoming. My spine listened to its own counsel. I pictured the events of Saturday unfolding, the way a meteorologist pictures a weather system moving across a map, people packing boxes, a moving truck idling, a locksmith arriving to test a knob that would refuse to turn. I did not rehearse a single line of confrontation. I did not anticipate an argument. I placed my trust entirely in the documents that were already filed, the signatures that were already dry, and the law that had already spoken. Sleep came like a gentle tide that respects the shoreline. When it receded, I woke before the dawn. The room was washed in the first pale light of morning. My phone lay dark and silent on the nightstand. On the table, the index card waited. Speak once. Let silence finish the paragraph. I slipped it into my purse next to my own keys and a small screwdriver. If the storm was indeed coming, I would meet it standing on my own 2 feet, not shouting, not pleading, just present, steady, and securely anchored. I felt a profound and unwavering sense of readiness. Saturday arrived with a brilliant, cloudless blue sky. The kind of day people describe as perfect for a wedding or a picnic. I was not at the Penthouse. I had no intention of being anywhere near it. Instead, I was sitting at a small, secluded table in a quiet cafe in Carroll Gardens, a cup of black coffee cooling before me. Beside the cup, the brass plate, still wrapped in its protective tissue paper, rested like a sleeping promise. From my vantage point, the city moved on without my participation, and for the first time in a long while, this was a deliberate choice. I had spoken with Mr. Peterson the night before. His instructions were simple and clear. His job was not to create a scene, block the elevator, or engage in any argument. His sole responsibility was to deliver an envelope. Inside that envelope, there was no emotional plea, no angry recrimination, just the cold, hard, and beautiful truth, printed on heavy legal paper, stamped, signed, and officially recorded by the City of New York. At 9:05 a.m., according to the text Mr. Peterson sent me. They arrived. David was in the lead, walking with a brisk, purposeful stride as if to personally shield Jessica's parents from any potential inconvenience. Jessica followed, her lips pressed into a thin, triumphant line. Behind them came her father, a man I had met only twice, leaning heavily on a cane. Her mother clutched a large tote bag filled with cleaning supplies, ready to claim her new territory. As the building's heavy glass doors sighed open, Mr. Peterson, looking impeccable in his neat gray sweater, stepped forward. He moved with the calm, unhurried precision of a man who had observed decades of human drama play out in that very lobby. "Good morning," he said, his voice imbued with a formal courtesy that can be far more disarming than any overt hostility. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a crisp white envelope. "Before you proceed upstairs, Mr. Vance," he said, holding it out. "This is for you." David's face clouded with impatience. "What is it, Henry? We're on a tight schedule." Mr. Peterson did not answer the question directly. "It is from your mother's attorney," he stated simply, and placed the envelope into David's outstretched hand. Jessica glanced at the envelope, a flicker of unease momentarily disturbing her composed expression before she quickly masked it. "We can look at that later, David," she urged, already moving toward the elevator bank. But David's curiosity had always been one of his defining and sometimes problematic traits. He tore open the top of the envelope and slid out the stack of papers. His eyes scanned the first page, moving quickly at first, then slowing down as the words began to register. His mouth tightened. Jessica's father, leaning on his cane, moved closer. "What's it say, son?" David didn't reply. His gaze was frozen on the lines that mattered most. Owner of record, the Arthur Vance Foundation for Home and Hearth. Life estate holder, Eleanor Vance. He read the sentences again, and then a third time, as if the sheer force of his will could alter their meaning. His expression shifted through a rapid series of states, from confusion to stark disbelief, and then to something much harder to name, the sickening, sinking awareness that the rules of the game had been irrevocably changed without his knowledge or consent. Jessica reached for the papers, her hand trembling almost imperceptibly. She read over his shoulder, her eyes narrowing as she tried to find a loophole in the dense, unforgiving legal language. "What does this mean?" she finally whispered, the words barely audible. Mr. Peterson, who had remained standing at a polite, respectful distance, filled the thick silence. It means, he said, his voice calm and even, that the foundation is the legal owner of the property. Your mother, Mrs. Vance, retains the sole and exclusive legal right to live there for the remainder of her life. No one is permitted to move in without her explicit written consent. Jessica's mother, who had been ready to ascend and start scrubbing, suddenly found the floor tiles intensely fascinating. Her husband shifted his weight, moving his cane from one hand to the other. His mouth opened, but no words emerged. David's jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle jumped. This is ridiculous, he muttered, but the words had no force behind them. They were hollow, the sound of a man trying to reclaim territory that had already been paved over and rezoned. Mr. Peterson's tone remained impeccably steady, almost gentle. I was instructed by her attorney to ensure you understood the legal standing before you proceeded. The documents have all been filed with the county. The transfer is final. The air in the grand lobby seemed to grow heavier, as if the marble itself were absorbing the tension. Jessica took the papers from David, folded them with a sharp, angry crease, and thrust them back at him. He didn't meet her furious gaze. The doorman, sensing the shift, had already summoned the elevator, its doors standing open, waiting, but no one moved toward it. For a long, excruciating moment, the small group stood stranded in the middle of the lobby, their carefully laid plans dissolving around them in the silent, opulent space. Jessica's father finally cleared his throat. Perhaps, he said, his voice strained, we should discuss this somewhere else. David didn't argue. He tucked the envelope under his arm and turned wordlessly toward the revolving door. Jessica followed, her face a pale, set mask. Her parents trailed behind, their earlier energy completely deflated, the bag of cleaning supplies now looking like a sad, foolish prop. Mr. Peterson watched them leave. Then he turned and walked back to his desk. From what he told me later, his expression remained unreadable, but he felt his shoulders settle, a little straighter than they had been before. I wasn't there to witness it firsthand, but I could picture every single detail with perfect clarity. Back in the cafe, I took a slow sip of my now cool coffee. The knot of tension that I had been carrying in my chest for weeks seemed to loosen by a fraction. There was no sense of gloating, no heady rush of victory, just the quiet, grounding knowledge that the boundaries I had so carefully constructed were holding, exactly as they were designed to. A barista passed my table with a clattering tray of clean mugs. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I noticed my own hands resting flat and steady on the table. Somewhere uptown, David was reading those sentences again, finally comprehending that they were unchangeable. I imagined the moment he would have to look at Jessica and acknowledge that this was not a fight he could win through pressure or emotional leverage. And I imagined Jessica's dawning realization that the woman she had dismissed as a soft, sentimental widow had in fact built a fortress she could not breach. Outside the cafe, the sun had shifted. I unwrapped the brass plate from its tissue paper and ran my thumb over the engraved letters. The Arthur Vance Foundation for Home and Hearth. It felt cool and certain in my hands. I wasn't going to install it today, but I knew I would soon. It would not be a declaration of war for them, but a quiet, permanent reminder for myself that the home Arthur and I had built now had a future, a purpose that belonged to something far larger than any one person's selfish entitlement. When I finally left the cafe, I walked with an unhurried pace. My steps had found their own rhythm again. Somewhere across the river, an elevator was sitting idle, and a weekend of plans had been completely erased. The storm had arrived, passed over, and left behind only the clear, unmistakable shape of what was mine. The weekend concluded without a single message. A week passed, then 2, then 3. My phone, once a source of anxiety, learned a new and welcome silence. The text thread from David lay dormant. I moved through my days like someone methodically reclaiming the rooms of their own house, my footsteps steady and sure, remembering exactly where all the light switches were. On the Monday after the aborted move, I returned to the penthouse. In my pocket, I carried the brass plate and a small screwdriver. Mr. Peterson was at his desk in the lobby, and gave me a respectful nod as I entered. He asked no questions about the preceding Saturday. He simply set a small box of clean new screws on the counter for me as I passed. Upstairs, the hallway was quiet. I unlocked my door, and the latch yielded with that familiar soft click that now sounded like a quiet affirmation. Inside, the rooms exhaled their silence to greet me. I set my tote bag down and walked directly to the balcony. The river was wearing a late morning shade of blue that had made its peace with the underlying gray. Gulls rode the currents of the wind. I stood there for a long time, letting the air find my hairline and the back of my neck, feeling the city's vastness not as a threat, but as a companion. I brewed tea, and the kettle answered with its old, unhurried whistle, a sound that apologized for nothing. The steam climbed, and the scent of bergamot drew a clean, bright line through the room. I carried my cup to the worn armchair by the window. The chair is not beautiful, but its arms have learned the exact shape of my own over the years. Arthur used to nap there, the newspaper slowly sliding from his lap to the floor. David used to curl up in it during thunderstorms, finding a safe harbor. I ran my hand along the smooth, worn wood of the armrest until a warmth gathered in my palm. I then unwrapped the brass plate and, with careful precision, mounted it on the interior wall near the entryway. The Arthur Vance Foundation for Home and Hearth. The letters were square and certain. I didn't linger to admire it. It was simply a fact, now stated. My days began to organize themselves into a new rhythm. There were long morning walks along the river promenade. Afternoons were spent at my desk with the foundation's bylaws and a pencil, sketching out ideas for its future. Evenings were given over to books whose sentences walked at a leisurely pace instead of sprinting. The apartment settled around me, and I settled with it. In the second week, a powerful storm blew across the city. Rain lashed against the balcony glass. The kettle's whistle and the wind's low moan braided themselves into a sober but beautiful duet. I moved my armchair a few inches to the left so the lamplight would fall perfectly on the page of my book. My phone remained on the counter, its screen dark. By the third week, news began to move through the building. The way weather moves along the river, steady, impersonal, and impossible to deny. Mr. Peterson phoned one afternoon to say the elevator reservations for my floor had been officially released, and the scheduled locksmith had canceled his appointment. His tone was perfectly neutral. He was delivering facts, the way a good clock delivers the time. Later, a neighbor I shared morning pleasantries with mentioned that a couple resembling Jessica's parents had toured a modest apartment in Queens, near her sister's building. She apologized if she was overstepping. I thanked her for treating information like sunlight. When I was alone again, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. George found me on the building's front stoop the next morning. We sat with our coffees, watching the delivery trucks perform their daily chaotic ballet. I told him what I'd heard. He listened without trying to design my feelings for me. When I was done, he gave a single final nod. "You didn't let yourself become a guest in your own home," he said. We let the words stand, a monument to a quiet victory. One afternoon, I sat in my armchair and watched the sky perform its own private drama. A barge slid upriver. A child on a nearby balcony was counting pigeons aloud. I realized I hadn't checked the time in hours. The room was holding me as if it had been practicing for years. Sometimes a wave of sorrow would tap at the door. I learned to let it in, offer it a chair not far from mine, and pour it a cup of tea without sugar. It never wrecked the place. It would look at what I had managed to repair, and then it would leave before dark. The rule became simple: everything was allowed to visit, but nothing could take up residence without my explicit permission. That evening, the intercom buzzed. It was Mr. Peterson again, his voice meticulously careful. "Mrs. Vance, your son is in the lobby. He has a guest with him." I thanked him and pressed the button to release the door. I set out 2 clean cups on the counter, but did not start the kettle. The knock came 3 minutes later. David stood in the doorway, his jaw set in a familiar tense line. Jessica was beside him, a folder clutched in her hand like a shield. They stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind them. I gestured toward the dining table, but they both remained standing in the entryway. Jessica spoke first. "We need to talk about what you did," she said, her voice crisp with indignation. "You blindsided us, Eleanor. My parents had movers scheduled. We had a locksmith. You made us look like complete fools. David folded his arms across his chest. Mom, this was an extreme overreaction. You barely even live here half the time. We offered you a practical solution to a real problem, and instead, you hid behind a lawyer and some foundation. He made the word foundation sound like a dirty trick. I picked up my cup of tea, which I had poured for myself, and held it with both hands, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. I didn't hide, I said, my voice quiet but clear. I made a decision and recorded it. The law is simply public clarity. I took a seat in my armchair. They watched me as if I had suddenly changed languages. Jessica took a step forward. This is unbelievably selfish. A family needed housing. You have that place in Brooklyn. You are one person rattling around in all this space. Why should this apartment sit here grieving with you when it could be holding people who actually need it? Selfish. I repeated the word, letting it hang in the air for a moment. Selfish is when you try to take the home of the person who gave you everything. Jessica's chin tilted up defiantly. David blinked, the accusation landing with a soft thud. I continued. I worked my entire life for this home. I sold the bakery that paid for your education and your wedding. I sat with stacks of bills no one else wanted to look at. I slept beside a wonderful man while he went through chemotherapy, and I held his hand until the very end. I bought this place so I could learn how to breathe again on my own. None of that gives you the right to repurpose my breath for someone else's convenience. Jessica gripped her folder. You're using memory as a weapon to excuse a lack of generosity. My parents are good, decent people. They've done nothing to you. They have also done nothing for me, I said plainly. And they are not my responsibility. Your husband, on the other hand, is. David bristled. That's not fair. It's not about fairness, it's about accuracy, I replied. The reality is simple. You came into my home, told me it now belonged to someone else, and informed me that I was banned from entering it. You didn't come for a conversation, you came with a bulldozer. My response was to build a fortress. It's a structure that does not require your permission to stand. He took a slow, deep breath, some of the fight seeming to drain out of him. He stared at the new brass plate by the entryway, as if seeing it for the first time. His voice was quieter when he finally spoke. Why didn't you just tell me? Because you weren't asking me for anything, I said gently. You were telling me. You were taking. When a person arrives with a verdict already in hand, I do not owe them a preface to my own. He rubbed his eyes, a gesture of exhaustion I knew well. I thought we were a family. I thought we were on the same side. We are, I said, when the side is dignity and respect. We are not when the side is entitlement. Emily thrust the folder she was holding onto the table. You have chosen a plaque on a wall over actual people. No, I corrected her. I have chosen stewardship over chaos. I have chosen to stop teaching my son that my love is a door he can break down and then call his actions coming home. David looked out the window at the river, which kept its steady, silent line. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, the way it used to be when he knew he'd made a mistake he couldn't easily fix. I didn't think it would hurt you like this. It hurt long before the paperwork, David, I said softly. It hurt the moment my son looked at me and saw nothing but square footage. It hurt when the word mother had to compete with the word asset for space in the air. He swallowed hard. What do you want me to do? Start by actually hearing me, I said. Then you can decide if you want to be my son in a way that doesn't involve demanding my keys. The room fell completely still. Finally, David spoke, his voice barely a whisper. If I apologize, will you change it back? No, I said without malice. An apology is not a tool for undoing consequences. It's a bridge to help you cross over to a better future. The foundation remains. But you are welcome to visit me. You are welcome to cross that bridge anytime you can leave your bulldozer at the curb. A flicker of something, almost a smile, then not, crossed his lips. Jessica exhaled, a sharp, defeated sound. She reached for his sleeve. We should go. He nodded. At the door he paused and looked at the brass plate one last time. He turned back to me. "Thank you for the tea," he said. "You didn't drink any," I replied, glancing at the empty, unused cup I had set out for him. He looked at it too. "Maybe next time," he said. They left. The door closed with its familiar, final click. The air in the room rearranged itself, settling. I stood up and listened as the silence finished the paragraph. Outside, the river held its course, and inside, finally, so did I. A week later, an envelope arrived. Inside, on a simple note card, was a message in David's handwriting. "We found a place for them. I'll be in touch when I can be a better version of myself." I slid the note into the family album and closed the cover. The house had relearned my quiet, and I had relearned its strength. I sat in my armchair, the evening light pouring in, and for the first time, I felt the truth of two sentences standing side by side. Home is where love stays. And if love leaves, the home is still mine.